Hey, I'm back, and today I want to talk about short delays. Short delays are really cool because they can add depth or width to your sound without really taking up too much space, and they don't sound necessarily as unnatural as reverb sometimes can, so these can be used with drier recordings. So let's get started. Let's do the shortest reverb to the longest. So the first one I want to talk about is just the Haas effect. This one is something you might be familiar with. It's fairly easy. Basically, if you take a sound, you move it all to one side, and then you put a delay of that same sound on the other side, and it creates a widening effect. So let me just let you hear this track. It's a guitar track, because I'm a guitarist, and it's completely dry. Okay, so now I'm going to use M-Delay multiband for this. And the Haas effect is usually between like 0 milliseconds and about 30 milliseconds. Obviously at 0 milliseconds you're not going to hear any delay, but you can do like 0.5 milliseconds, etc. I suggest not going down that low because that's going to cause phasing problems. I usually like to go between about 7 milliseconds and maybe 25 milliseconds, but of course choose whatever times work best for you. So let's see here, let's try 15. Another thing, I want to turn the feedback to 0. I don't want any feedback, I just want one delay. One thing before I forget, I should turn everything on the dry signal to the left. Bypass this. So if you're not listening in mono, you should be able to hear the guitar completely on the left side. Now I'm going to turn the delay completely to the right, like this. Let's turn it on and listen to it. It's also at completely 50% wet dry. Now you heard that sounded louder, but there's still kind of a problem. It seemed like it was on the left side. And the reason that is because it wasn't matched. We saw the left side was higher in volume than the right side. So let's try to match it by using this delay gain until both the left and right are matched in levels. There you go. So now it should sound like it's very, very wide. One thing to be careful with this is make sure you're not getting lots of phase canceling. I would check this in mono. So just use whatever plugin you want, or just in your DAW if it has a little knob here that says mono. And check to make sure it's not phasing. If it is, just change the delay time a little bit until it sounds a little bit better. Then take it out of mono and listen to it again, and it should still sound fine. Let's listen to this just one more time, and I'm going to bypass it every once in a while so you can hear the difference between the before and after. So as you heard, that actually makes a big difference. So this is a kind of cool technique you can use if you want something to be very wide. I wouldn't use it on everything because, like I said, it can cause phasing techniques, but on maybe one or two elements in a mix, especially like a background element, it can sound really cool. So let's move to the next one. This one I'm just gonna call like short delay or short room delay. If you don't know, on Melda Productions plugins, they have these A, B, C, D. These are all different like A/B switches. So here I'm just going to leave this Haas effect, and B, I'll do a different one. So for this one, just change a few of the settings. I don't want it synced to tempo. This one, this small room or just short delay, I usually think of it as between 35 to 85 milliseconds. Of course, somebody else might disagree with that, but I think generally that's a good starting place. And so let me set this like 50 milliseconds. For this, I also don't want the feedback to be too high, so I'm going to turn that almost all the way down. Turn the dry wet down. I'll leave it about 40. That's a little bit high, but this is just a demonstration. For actual mixing, you might want to turn it down a little bit lower. But this should actually sound like it's in a room as opposed to being completely dry. So let's hear this once. Oh, forgot to change this back to stereo. Here we go. My fault. One more time. So I think you heard there, it sounded like almost like a room effect. I'll play it one more time and bypass it and engage it so you can hear the difference. So if you're like me and you do lots of direct recording, you're probably used to that sound where it's very dry, it's right in your face, and frankly, for most things, it doesn't sound good. For some styles, it's okay, but generally, I want something, a little bit more spacious than that. But sometimes you don't want to put a huge reverb or anything like that on that, and this can help, just a slight bit of delay. I would probably turn this down a little bit. But a few things to note is this delay time, the longer you have it, the larger the room's going to seem, and the shorter delay time you have, the smaller the room is going to seem. So let's say if I move it down to, let's say, like 35 or 38. Let's hear this. That's like a small booth. And if I move it all the way up here to, let's say, around like 80 something, 81. That's starting to sound like a big room. So another thing to keep in mind is the wet and dry. If you want it to be more subtle, just use less wet signal. That seems obvious. And another thing you can do if you don't want it to seem quite so in your face, use this low pass filter here or on whatever delay plugin you're using, and rolling it off to between 4,000 to 1,000 hertz will help with guitar. For other instruments, obviously you can change that because other instruments have different frequency ranges. But if I move this down to, let's say, like 1,700, that should take off some of that high end and make it a little bit less prominent and noticeable. So that's another thing. Let me move the delay time down a little bit more, move it back to around 50. And the high pass can do the same thing, but for this, I think for guitar, I don't really need it unless I'm playing lots of low notes, but for other instruments, you might. So moving it up to around like 100 or so will definitely help clean it up if you feel your sound is muddy. And the other thing you can do with this is you can make it stereo. In this case, right now it's mono, and I think that's better for getting a sense of depth, but if you want a sense of width, you might want to spread it out. And we can do that by using the offset. So now it's at 52 milliseconds for both the left and right channels, but if I move the right channel, let's say, can I do 8? Almost 8. There we go, 8 milliseconds. So now the left will be playing 52 milliseconds, and the right will be playing 60 milliseconds. And this should give us a wide stereo sound. So let's hear that. So as you heard, it's a lot bigger that way. I think it's obviously probably a little bit louder also, but I think you can hear the difference. It's not just louder, it's also wider, and it gives it a little bit of depth too. And one more thing we can do to really enhance that is by going into this edit screen here. So we have more parameters, and one of the parameters I need is a modulator. So we're going to use this, and we're going to modulate the delay time just a slight bit. So click on this, move it a bit, turn it on. If I move this up a little bit faster here, and now I have it's 52 milliseconds to 69 milliseconds, this is going to sound like a chorus, which isn't what I want, but I just want to show you how to do that if you're interested. That's too much. We want this to be more subtle. So now I have like 52 milliseconds. Let's try 55 milliseconds. So it's not moving quite as much, and let's slow it down here. Maybe around this, a little bit less than 1 hertz or 0.1 hertz. Now it's going fairly slow, and if we listen to it now, it should sound more spacious and a little bit lush, but it doesn't have the obvious chorusing. Maybe some of you couldn't hear that, so I'll turn on and off the modulation just so it's more apparent. So it's very subtle, but if you listen closely, you can kind of hear it moving, but it's not an obvious chorus. So to just go over that again, I would say use the low-pass filter to kind of control the sound of the room. So if you want it to sound like it's a metal room, turn it all the way up. If you want it to sound like a wooden room or something with dampened walls, turn it down to around the 4,000 to 1,000 region. Use the delay times to control the size of the room. A smaller room, like 35, 40 milliseconds, will sound like a really tight booth or a small room, and like 85 or 75 will sound like a larger room. And if you want it to be wider, use the stereo offset to make it stereo. And if you want to add more depth, leave it in mono, and perhaps use a little bit of feedback, but don't use too much. Let's move on to the last delay, and that's the slapback delay. So we're going to do the same things we did before. Turn off the sync. And slapback delay I usually think of as being between like 85 and 200 milliseconds. So first let's move this to where we had it before, like 50%, or say 40%. Let's move the time to, let's say, around 100 milliseconds. And one of the differences between the short delay I showed before and the slapback is the slapback usually has a little bit more feedback. So let me see feedback at about 50%. And this one I usually like to keep in mono. I think it sounds better that way. But let's listen to this. So if you're familiar with some kind of older recordings, like maybe early rock or rockabilly or something like that, you've probably heard this lots of times. Of course, I can do the same thing with the high pass and the low pass, but generally I don't like to low pass this too much because I kind of like that high ringing sound in there. You can do a little bit, so maybe around like around 2000 at the lowest or so, but leaving a little bit in there I think kind of enhances the effect. Obviously you can mess with the wet and dry to increase or decrease the effect, and the same thing with the feedback. I'll show you the same thing that applied to the early one applies to this one as far as delay times. Having a longer delay will make it sound like a larger room. So let's try 200, which I think is about the max. If you go above 200, it's going to start sounding like distinct delays. But let's listen to this. So as you can hear, it sounds larger, but even at 200, it's starting to sound like distinct delays. I had to turn down the wet-dry ratio just because of that. But, of course, mess with this however you want. In general, I would say the same thing. If you band pass it by using the high-pass and low-pass filter, it will be a little bit more subtle if you want to do that. And, of course, if you want to, you can mess with the left and right offset to make this more stereo, but in general I don't like to, because lots of those classic recordings didn't have that. They were all in mono, and I think it kind of adds a feel and a vibe to it. But do what you want. You don't have to listen to me, but I hope you do, and I hope you give me a thumbs up and you like this. If you like this, tell me down below and I'll try to do another one on longer delays. I hope this helped you out, and if it did, give me a thumbs up, and until next time, see you.